welcome to Tuesday Newsday, your #1 resource for the entire week's worth of VR news. Meta just showed off 2 new VR prototypes that look absolutely insane, from perfect pass-through to the return of varifocal displays in the public eye with the highest resolution yet. They're unlike anything we've ever seen before. But that's not it. A brand new 4K per eye VR headset from a very unlikely source has just popped up. Horizon Worlds may actually be getting pretty good, and rest in peace, Echo VR. We got all that and so much more, so let's just get right into the news. Okay, so let's start off with something absolutely crazy and unexpected. A brand new VR headset has just popped up from an unlikely source with some pretty wild specs to back it up. Just recently leaked, but then confirmed by the company, this is the Visor, a micro OLED 4K per eye VR headset set to launch sometime next year from the software company Immersed. Now, some of you may be familiar with Immersed, but in case you've never heard of it, Immersed is a productivity application that I've actually used quite a bit before. It's basically the only application out there that allows you to connect to pretty much any PC or Mac and set up to 5 virtual monitors in your play space to, well, work on things. And it seems that this headset isn't so much what you'd think of as a typical VR headset like a Quest 2 or beyond, but instead an extension of the Immersed application. Right now, it doesn't look like this is going to work with many other applications, and while this headset is supposedly 6 degree of freedom and does have these 4K per eye micro OLED displays, all of that is primarily intended for virtual monitor viewing, not so much gaming or anything else. Which kind of makes sense, I suppose. I think the only real complaint I've had with Immersed is that the typical 2K per eye resolutions that we have on most VR headsets just isn't really enough to be a true monitor replacement, which is, I think, why Immersed is working on their own hardware. But I guess I do have some concerns if it doesn't work with OpenXR or Steam VR. It would just be a shame considering the hardware specifications, but I also have to mention I haven't actually seen any hardware yet or had it in hands. I've only seen renders so far, and until I see it and actually try the hardware, well, it's not actually hardware yet. So I'm definitely staying a little skeptical until I actually try it. The Immersed CEO did state that there's going to be way more information in a public release tomorrow, but now we can get into these meta prototypes because, I mean, just look at these things. They're absolutely wild. But also in this conversation, I want to talk about how different this R&D side of Meta is compared to everything that we see publicly, because that has a big part in what these prototypes will mean for the future of VR and how they'll trickle down to consumer headsets in the future. And on top of that, you may actually get to try one of these, which is also crazy. But let's just start with the wild looking one before we get into the one that I'm really excited about. This is the Flamera, a prototype meant to explore potential solutions to a big problem that Meta has had. Well, really a problem that everyone has had, and it has to do with perspective and stereo correct pass-through. The issue is basically, how do you offer perspective correct mixed reality with cameras that aren't directly placed in front of your eyes? If you've got cameras below or above or to the right, well, it's just not going to be perspective correct. And right now, the way that most pass-through works, like for example on the Quest 2, is Meta takes the total image of the pass-through cameras and calculates a reprojection of the camera feed into approximately the correct position for your eyes, allowing you to see pass-through mostly correctly from the right perspective. But as I'm sure you've noticed if you've ever tried one of these headsets, this leads to a wobbly, distorted image with lots of visual artifacts. But with Flamera, they took a totally different approach with something called a light-filled pass-through. Instead of one lens per camera sensor, Flamera uses a lens array that only lets in relevant light to the sensor. And that information is then stitched together into one single image that you see from your perspective correct vision. And as you can see from the Through the Lens video, this is probably the most accurate pass-through I've ever seen on a VR headset. And it's almost comical when they switch back to the reprojection-based pass-through as a comparison. It's crystal clear versus, I don't know, a muddy mess. And we'll get back to the Flamera's purpose in a moment, but I want to talk about the other prototype, the one that I'm really excited about personally. This is Butterscotch Varifocal, an iteration on something that we talked about a few months ago. So for a long time now, the holy grail of VR optics have been something called varifocal displays. I've talked about them a bit in the past, but it's been a while, so I'm gonna do a very, very simplified recap for a moment. While Flamera looks to solve a few problems with pass-through, Butterscotch looks to solve a much deeper problem with VR in general. a phenomenon known as the Vergence Accommodation Conflict. And if you've ever tried to hold an object in VR really close to your face, you've probably already experienced this problem. Everything will get really blurry and you may even go cross-eyed or get a little disoriented. The problem is that VR headsets and lenses just don't act like our eyes and brain. And that not only makes things look unrealistic, but it can also lead to some pretty unpleasant effects like eye strain or disorientation. And varifocal displays look to solve this by shifting the focal plane depending on what you're looking at, which makes VR look incredibly realistic because it's mimicking that natural blur and focus that we have in reality. It's shifting the focal plane like your eyes would, but of course the screen is still staying the same distance away. And we've seen varifocal prototypes before with the Half Dome 1, 2, and 3, even seeing a non-mechanical varifocal system with the third one, but this butterscotch prototype is special because it not only has these varifocal displays, but also has probably the highest resolution and pixels per degree of any VR headset ever made, at least any of them that's publicly talked about, with a whopping 55 pixels per degree. To give some reference, the Valve Index sits at only 14 ppd, and the Quest 2 only has around 20. And of course, this comes at some downsides for butterscotch. It only has a 50-degree field of view, which may sound laughable. It's also expensive, mechanical, and probably pretty heavy. But for those 50 degrees, this right now is probably the most realistic experience that you can get on the entire planet. Between varifocal displays and this super high resolution, depth is rendered much more correctly than anything else, and the image is clearer than anything else. Which gets us onto why these even matter. This technology probably isn't trickling into the Quest 4 anytime soon. But what's going on in those labs is still legitimately the cutting edge of this technology. Looking at this technology is the equivalent of being interested in physics and hearing there's a new particle or something and getting excited. Or maybe even just getting excited about the potentials of a new ambient temperature superconductor, for example. It may not change your buying habits tomorrow, but it's still really interesting at the core of the tech. And I think it's even more interesting how different Meta's R&D division is from its consumer division. Outlined in a recent blog from the R&D team, the goals of the Reality Labs research team isn't necessarily to try and build the best consumer device ever that makes VR go mainstream. It's to explore and solve the problems of VR that nobody is touching, and also, surprisingly, to do it openly so this research is available to people that want to build. I mean, the article opens with, quote, "There are two types of people, those who think VR will change the world and those who haven't tried it yet." And I think oftentimes in my video, I give Meta a really hard time, and sometimes that's really necessary, but it's pretty eye-opening to see that behind these Zuckerbergs and metaverse claims, and the honestly off-putting consumer-facing side of the company, the heart of it that is really driving VR research forward by decades is really actually in it for the right reasons. And I think this really resonates with me because the main reason I actually became so passionate about VR isn't because of Beat Saber or VR Chat or Quest 2s. It's really because every step we take to explore virtual reality and this cool technology, we in turn learn more and more about the physical world around us. I don't think there's ever been a technology out there that really looks at perception and reality in the way that virtual reality does. And the same goes for augmented reality and XR, of course. But you get the point, and I think some people will get that, and some people will only see the industry for dollar signs, but from the way that the research team talks about VR, I don't get that feel, especially because of their whole plan to actually show these headsets off. The impact that they want to make isn't just developing and researching, they plan on inspiring the industry through a whole philosophy of, quote, demo or die. They obviously can't sell butterscotch because it would probably cost more than a house to buy, but they can demo it to as many people as possible to inspire them to get into this field, to show them how good it can be when the proper work is done. So Butterscotch, Varifocal, and Flamera will both be at SIGGRAPH this year for people to demo, which is really, really cool. And honestly, maybe the consumer side of Meta could use a little of the R&D team's energy. It might really do them some good. And really, at this point, I don't mind Meta spending all their money on the R&D team. Keep doing that, they deserve it. Which brings us to the sad part of today's video. Despite the in-person protests where fans literally flew a plane over Meta's HQ begging them not to do it and the online protests asking them to do the same, officially at 10 a.m. yesterday, the Echo VR servers were shut down forever. After 6 years of becoming one of the most beloved VR titles ever released, I mean, this game even has a big part of this channel's history too. It was the background footage of my very first video, but now the servers are dead and the game's gone. And I've already made 2 videos videos on this topic earlier this year when it was first announced, and I've already said my piece, and that's even been echoed by people like Critical. But now that it's happened, I guess this is a bit of closure. Really, the whole situation regarding Echo was just a really crappy thing on Meta and Ready at Dawn's part. The game, despite having a lower active user count than something like Gorilla Tag, still had a community of tens of thousands that played every single day, which is hard to do in VR. Hundreds of games try it, and a handful end up actually building any sort of community. And it's just a real head scratcher why Meta would decide to shut down a perfectly good game that still had a lot of life left in it. And it's also where the consumer-facing side of Meta, ironically, is more anti-consumer than the research side. That doesn't interact with consumers at all. And all I can really say regarding Echo VR is rest in peace. You'll go down forever as a highlight in VR history, something that brought people together. And to you, Meta, taking down a game with an active player population with zero recourse, kind of a dick move. And it does make it feel like you don't care about people, which isn't the best look. And I also know that people are tired of me talking about this, probably because you guys didn't play Echo at all, and that's perfectly fine. I totally understand if you don't care about the Echo situation. But to all the people that did get burnt, it's hard not to be empathetic, especially in a situation where no empathy was given by the head company. But really, just moving forward, I truly hope that next month when Connect happens, Meta has something really good to replace Echo with. Maybe that was why they canceled it in the first place, and I hope that's the case. I will just say that in the future, if you ever do this sort of thing again, maybe announce the replacement first before you just rip down a game. I don't know. But anyways, Connect, Meta's yearly event where they normally release hardware and where the Quest 3 and probably a bunch of other VR titles will be released or at least announced, crossing my fingers for GTA, has had its dates confirmed. This year, September 27th and 28th, Meta's VR ambitions will take its next step. And as we get closer to that, I'm sure we're gonna hear a lot more from it. So probably one of the more surprising things this news day isn't so much the prototypes in Visor, it's actually the potential that Horizon Worlds, Meta's VR social platform, may actually be getting pretty good. After months of getting memed and Meta struggling to grow its user base, a pretty huge promised feature, asset importing, has finally showed up, well, at least for some people. And to showcase this, a first-party Horizon World, Super Rumbles, has just released, and it's a first-person shooter within the platform, and it's actually pretty darn good. I think a lot of people think I hate Horizon Worlds, which is not necessarily true. It just was really bad for a long period of time, which doesn't look great for Meta or optics. That's the reason why it was memed. But after giving this a go, I do think this is a definite step in the right direction, and I'm really curious to see where Horizon goes in the next year, especially considering that after years of rumors, Roblox has officially made it to the Quest Store. Well, not the main app store, but it's on App Lab in beta with a few limitations. And it's also not too bad, actually. There's been a lot of hate for it as well, which I can definitely understand. Right now, there are very few working VR builds that show off the capabilities of Roblox VR, and out of those working builds, the frame rate and controls leave a lot to be desired, and the Quest 2 definitely has a hard time keeping up with Roblox, but that's kind of the point of the beta, to get significantly more VR testers in, and also to get people to make more VR content for Roblox. And I think between VR Chat, Horizon Worlds, Rec Room, and Roblox, social VR is about to get very interesting over the next year. And I'm really curious to see what this competition brings out in all of these platforms. But now it's time for question of the week from Nosyless. If you could have any flat screen game of your choice get a VR port, what would I choose? So I've actually answered this a few times, as each time my answer gets a little different. For a while, I really wanted a good Overwatch style game that allows me to be in the action. Like imagine holding a Reinhardt shield or taking out a Genji blade. But my ideas have kind of evolved over time. I still would love to see Overwatch in VR. But right now, I imagine if I could bring a flat game or a hypothetical game into VR, I'd honestly love to play a Yu-Gi-Oh! Social VR trading card game. Of course, I'd love a Pokemon game as well, but that's kind of obvious. Who wouldn't want to catch Pokemon in VR? But there's just something unique in my brain about grabbing a dual disc and slamming a Blue Eyes White Dragon on the field to have it show up 30 feet tall in front of me. Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. And that was question of the week. Make sure to leave your own down below, and I may just answer yours next. And I also want to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters for making this video possible, especially my Omegas. And of course, remember to like this video if you loved it, subscribe if you want more of this, and hit that freaking bell if you just can't live without it. Much love, Thrill out.